Hey everyone, this is Neon Polygons, and today I want to take a look at the Steel Battalion experience for the original Xbox. For those of you who don't know, Steel Battalion was a game released in 2002 by Capcom that utilized a special controller to simulate being inside a mech. When it came out in 2002, it was actually one of the more critically acclaimed games of the year, most notably for the simulation experience. But it was also a controversial release because of its price tag, coming out at a retail price of $500, which essentially was a very expensive endeavor to just play one game. Now, obviously, the reason for that high cost or high price tag was because of the controller itself. And that really is the main draw, I think even more so than the game. But when you look at it, this is a experience that I believe is totally worth it. Even essentially 20 years later, this game, this controller is, yet to be replicated, by what I would guess any accessory ever out in the market. So as you can see, it's quite a huge accessory, and it's divided essentially into what they call a 3-block system. When you look at the left block of the controller, that's essentially for really kind of controlling your speed and your I would say like your chafing left and right, whereas the middle block is more so for the settings of your tank essentially. And on the right side, or essentially the right block, that would be considered where you would take a lot more of your action items, such as like, firing and changing your cockpit views, more or less just kind of, taking action. It actually does also come with a pedal system, which you'll see later in this video, where it's, kind of works in a way where you kind of have to like drive, I would say, manual, where it has a, as I can best put it, a acceleration, brake, and kind of gear shifter. And I say gear shifter, but it's more or less kind of like a dodge kind of paddle. But so it can look quite intimidating when you're actually like using the game or playing the game and using this controller, and you see like just all the amounts of buttons, but in reality it's actually quite a simple experience. I kind of laugh at the point that, or at the fact that it actually came with a textbook of a manual. I actually purchased this secondhand and didn't get the manual that came with it, but it was quite simple and easy to figure out how to like actually play the game using the controller. In fact, as I'm showing here in kind of like a first person view of what it's like to actually play the controller, it kind of guides you along in terms of like what you actually have to press. So as soon as you kind of like start a game, it more or less just tells you, click the start button, then click the ignition. It then shows you a bunch of toggles, essentially, that you have to kind of hit. So essentially, you just go to your left block, you match up the configurations that's showing on screen, and just essentially flick all these switches and kind of, like, I guess, semi-power up your mech. So, everything's pretty easy peasy so far. As you see, like, as soon as you hit the switches, your controller and your mech start powering up. And then there's kind of like the part where kind of people kind of get stumped. And this is where people kind of don't really know to figure out what to do. You'll see the red start button essentially say start, but most people just keep clicking it and nothing will happen. What you essentially have to do is you have to wait for the bars on screen to kind of reach past 75%, and then you press the start button. Once that happens, your mech essentially is kind of ready to roll, and all you have to do is essentially press on the acceleration button and move forward. So as I'm showing you here, the left stick is really to kind of strafe left to right, whereas the right stick is to kind of like aim, or as I would say, kind of like aim your weapon cursor and kind of I wouldn't say move forward, because that's really kind of what the acceleration buttons are, or the acceleration pedal is for. So again, simply the controls are left stick is more or less kind of chafing left to right, and kind of like your up-down view on the analog stick on the actual stick itself. Moving forward and back is done by the paddles. And you control your speed kind of by a gear shifter on the left block. The right block again is for like aiming and firing your weapons, and as you'll hear on in my gameplay footage, you really just kind of have to like utilize like your map system to kind of figure out where to go. So there's a button on the on the right block that controls the your viewpoints. Essentially, what I mean by viewpoints, it shows you in your display kind of like all these kind of data that you'll need to access, such as like your maps, if you want to zoom in or zoom out of like your, I guess your viewpoint on the field, and you'll have like kind of like a monitor on screen, a little mini monitor, and it can show you essentially, do you want to like look from behind you, in front of you. So think of it kind of like when you're driving a car and you're parking, it kind of gives you the view of like what's like behind you as you start parking your car. So as you see here, as I'm playing, it can get a little bit hectic just because you're trying to figure out where the enemy is coming from, where you're being shot at. You kind of have to kind of get a little bit of a familiarity with the aiming of your weapon, but at the same time the controlling of your viewpoint and chafing left to right with like the left stick. So the best way to kind of think about it is the two sticks are essentially kind of like your left analog stick and right analog stick, and with the buttons on it being the trigger buttons in terms of like what do you got to figure out where to go, or what to hit. So as I'm kind of just playing the game, once you kind of see footage of the game itself, it's not anything really kind of graphically amazing. In fact, I would say probably the more duller aspect of the game is like kind of like the aesthetics itself. But that's not why you're playing this. The whole experience with this controller is to kind of give you the feeling of being, in a tank in a futuristic war. And war technically is not supposed to be colorful. So as you like look at the game, it's very drab, it's very kind of monotone in the color scheme. And so with that, it does kind of give the feeling of what kind of a future war would kind of, look like. And kind of controlling through this mech system, it's not kind of like a speedy process. Again, like think about like kind of being in a tank. These are kind of slow, just chugging along machine. So as you play the game itself, you'll start to realize that it's not a really fast-paced game. It's very methodic and kind of, in a sense, I wouldn't say very strategic, but it is like essentially you are deliberately planning about maybe like 3 steps ahead of where you're trying to position your mech. So as I'm kind of playing the game here, I know I'm kind of blocking out the view, just to kind of show you how it works with the controller. You're really just kind of more or less just controlling the sticks to kind of fire away, and anytime you kind of see one of the buttons like light up, it's prompting you to essentially kind of like trigger something. So one of the key things to kind of realize is that if you kind of get in trouble, you're supposed to press the eject button. And if you don't eject in time, your mech essentially kind of explodes and you die with the mech. And more importantly, the thing to realize why you have to eject is essentially your save will permanently go away. So let's get to like really kind of the meat of like why you want to play this game, and that's really for the controller itself. And to really truly experience this controller, you got to play it like in the dark to see kind of like all the lights, just light up, and just kind of seeing the whole button schemes, just kind of like self-configure, and it's just really a cool experience of just showing like a multi-button simulation. So again, like just to kind of show you from a first person view, you press the start button or the ignition button to kind of just kick things off. As you kind of just look closer on screen, it just shows you again like what are the switches that you kind of have to like boost, and as you look at the left block, they all match up with the settings that are on screen. So you just pretty much just toggle the switches and let it boost up. Then the controller will start like its whole like boot up sequence, which is pretty cool to see. And then the part where people always get stomped on is the start button. So most people just keep thinking you press the start button and your mech is released and you're good to go. Again, what actually happens is you have to wait for the meters to kind of go above, all of them to go above 75%, and press the start button at that point in time to essentially ignite your engines. So once you kind of get that done, you kind of move your gear shifter out of like reverse neutral into like 1 through 5. Then you press the acceleration pedal, or step on the acceleration pedal, and you start moving and start like aiming your right stick to start like aiming your weapon, and your left stick to chafe left and right and essentially like turn direction. So it's a pretty cool experience. I'm kind of showing you this viewpoint just to show what it looks like controlling the stick from a first person perspective. Would I recommend trying to get this? To be honest with you, yeah, I actually do think it is worth the price tag at $300. It's not something that I would say has a high replay value, but I think for the game difficulty, the experience of using this controller, the ability to actually do a LAN setup if other people who can actually get an Xbox and also get this controller as well. It's not an experience that you're going to be able to replicate at any time ever in the future. So I think that's one of the things that I totally think it's worth it to get it now, especially before it just goes up in any value once people start realizing the beauty of this accessory. And again, it's just the fact that, this is a really immersive experience, the best way I can kind of frame it. Once you play this, I will honestly say, like, even going to an arcade, it kind of somewhat pales in comparison to what this controller is capable of. I think probably the only thing I could think of that is as close as possible to as cool of experience is to a flight simulator controller. And, again, unless you're like really, a pilot in training, you're not really going to have that type of experience of actually being able to, get your hands on that type of like controller accessory. So as I'm showing here on screen, there's a lot of stuff that you'll see kind of in your heads up display. And a lot of these buttons that you'll see like on the right block, they help control the configurations for what you'll see. So you can actually kind of zoom in, zoom out, change your weapons. As I'm showing here, there's some like odd functions such as like using washing your windows and an extinguisher. Now, surprisingly, when you kind of run too fast in this game, or I guess like your gear is on 5 and you're stepping on the acceleration button or paddle, the acceleration paddle, and yet you're also at the same time chafing too hard to left or to right, your mech will actually start to tip over. And I don't know why, but the reason to actually get up is by pressing the washing button. And it gives you those indicators to actually, the controller does help you to kind of figure out like what you need to do or what's the button you need to press to kind of proceed and move on or get out of a rut, which is kind of cool that essentially it does have, semi-intelligence or a semi-intuitive experience for, people who are not going to read that manual and just want to jump into the game like quickly. So again, as I'm showing here, I'm going to actually press the eject button just to kind of just get out of the mech, just to show that viewpoint of what it looks like. And, as you start taking quite a bit of hits, that's when the controller actually starts saying to you, or, it starts flashing red on screen, and the controller just goes chaotic and says, like, press the eject button now. So, as I'm showing here, these are kind of like the acceleration pedal, the brake, and the kind of the dodge, I guess, paddle, that I guess the best way for me to kind of describe it. And then just showing kind of like the interaction as you interact with the controller. It interacts back, you press a button, it lights up. You turn the gear shifter lights as well also change. There's a radio dial on it. Every button here essentially has a reaction to it. Now, unfortunately, with my controller, for whatever reason, one of the buttons stopped lighting up. I can't explain why. It actually was working as recently as a year ago, I know. And, I don't really use this controller quite often, so I'm not quite sure why it's not working. And as you can see here, it's the main weapon button that, for whatever reason, like once I click it, it just doesn't work. So, just want to kind of show like what this controller is like, and from an experience standpoint, again, like I will wholeheartedly say, even for its price tag, it's totally worth it. I don't think there's anything like that in the market. Now, if you really want to see like kind of just like how this like looks as a showpiece, get the game Steel Battalion Line of Contact. Unfortunately, it's an Xbox Live game, so you pretty much can't do anything with it. But what you can do is when it's kind of like in its view mode, the buttons on the controllers just all automatically light up, and it's just kind of like a sight to see, like somewhat like a Christmas light show. So that's really kind of all I have to say about the Steel Battalion experience. It's nothing but high accolades on my end. But I want to know, what's your opinion on the Steel Battalion controller? Do you think it's actually worth its current used asking fee of about, I would say, $300 to $500 a piece? In my opinion, again, I think it's totally worth it. But what do you guys think? Do you guys just think this is kind of just like, too much of a quick shot, that it's just not worth it? Or do you feel it's something that, it's definitely worth the investment? Again, from my opinion, this is something that will never be emulated, and something that can never be emulated. So, as I leave you guys here, I want to know, what's your opinion on this controller in this game? I definitely think it's a must get, but if you have other opinions, let me know in the comments below.